All right, AP Biology. This is try number 2 on this video. Without any further ado, this is lecture 2, lesson 2. Let's dive into it together, okay? About evolution. Evolution is characterized by a change in genetic makeup of a population over time. It's all about change. We're talking about alleles, right? Differences in allele frequencies. And so this conversation is all a little bit about, or mostly about evidence. And so it describes the type of data that provide evidence for evolution. Of course, being at a Christian school, in the cross of Christ, in creation and God being the creator in Genesis, we would love to have discussions about some of this stuff. For time, or for the objectives of this video, I'm not going to dive into some of that. I'm going to keep, you on the straight and narrow as far as the AP test goes. But I hope you trust in Christ's straight and narrow way and believing as there is a creator, because there is problems believing one cell comes from one cell gave rise to the complexity that we see on this planet. It's hard to defend that. Explain how morphological, biological, or biochemical and geological data provide evidence for organisms that have changed over time. And so, there's a lot of evidence, and it adds to our understanding of evolution. Evolution does happen. It definitely does happen. Fossils can be dated. Again, a young Earth creationists would have an issue with this. There's a lot of assumptions with this. The rate of decay. There's an assumption of how much carbon-14 is in the actual sample, but in general, there is ways to date as far as age goes, fossils and stuff like that, geographical data, and also homologies. Vestigial structures represented by common ancestry. Darwin drew like this tree of life where it kind of like branched multiple ways, and something like this, and like all of that, and then something like that. Well, so that would be a common ancestor. But then there's more recent common ancestors. It could be there, it could be there, it could be there. These are all common ancestors. And of course, comparing DNA and nucleotide sequences and protein or amino acid sequences. Okay, the more closely DNA is the same, the more recent a common ancestor. Okay. Of course, we're aligned by common answer. We just talked about that. So describe the fundamental molecular and cellular features shared. Shared is a key evolutionary word. Shared across all domains of life. Domains, 3 domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And so many fundamental molecular and cellular features and processes are conserved. That's another key evolutionary word. Conserved, which means they are preserved, basically. They don't change. And so, again, same data between evolutionists and creationists, those who are atheists and those who are Christians, same data that the world gives us, but through one lens. It's all about a lens, right? You got your glasses, right? Horrible glasses. But basically, a biblical worldview says, hey, we all share common qualities and common traits because we all have a common creator. And life shares commonalities, okay? Structural and functional evidence supports the relatedness of all organisms. Okay, so Darwin knew about artificial selection when humans are doing the selecting. That's kind of a brief recap over last lecture. And so because he knew about that, Darwin drew some inferences when he started studying natural selection and adaptation. Observation number 1, he drew inferences from observations, trying to use previous experience to explain what we see in real life. Observation number 1. Members of population often vary. Look at all the variation right here in this insect, this ladybug. We have size of, the circles, the black spots. We have shading, size of the entire organism. There's a ton of variation right here. Okay, but some of those organisms, now when you think variation, you should automatically start thinking, okay, fitness. Well, that's a horrible S. Fitness. Which of these animals has a higher chance of surviving and reproducing, because more offspring are produced than the environment can support. Therefore, there's competition. And only the offspring that are best suited for the environment survive and reproduce. Many of them fail to survive and reproduce. Okay, so here's a spore cloud. Here's all these baby mushrooms, thousands upon thousands of baby mushrooms. The forest floor is not covered in mushrooms, right? So only a select few survive. Okay, so here's some inferences that Darwin gave. Inference number 1. Individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing tend to leave more offspring. Okay, Inference number 2, so more offspring. Okay, you survive or you reproduce, you have those favorable traits. This unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in a specific environment. Remember, we're talking about a specific environment, not any environment, over generations. Okay, so Darwin was influenced by Malthus. Malthus believed that war, famine, and disease would keep human populations in check, be kind of like limiting factors. Of course, the Industrial Revolution shot through Malthusian, predictions and stuff like that. But yeah, human populations, they were kept in check for a long time because food supplies and other resources were limited. Industrial Revolution just, completely threw that out the window. But Darwin applied this concept to overproduction and scarcity of resources to natural populations. And so he proposed that individuals with advantageous traits, again, all due to random chance, based upon inheritance, random chance. Okay, chance is an interesting word when it comes to theology, but we're talking about biology here. Would be more likely to survive predation, more likely to survive and adverse physical conditions. So if these produce more offspring, then those favorable traits would increase. And over time, that possibly could lead to adaptation and even speciation, which will be one of our last conversations. All right, so Darwin reasoned that even if advantages are slight, we're talking like not even that much, like just very slight advantage. We're talking about, you got to have a lot of years for evolution. So many, many years will be able to cause dramatic modifications. Okay, pause it right here and do these questions. Go. Okay, so evidence. There's some gaps that Darwin didn't understand. DNA, for example, genes, all that sort of stuff. But these are some observations that now have increased our understanding of evolution. Direct observations in labs, homology, fossil record, biogeography, okay? An example from another textbook is soapberry bugs found in Florida. They use their beak to feed on seeds, but their beak sizes differ based upon their environment. In southern Florida, let's do a different color. They feed on large fruit of the balloon vine. Okay, they have long beaks. In central Florida, they feed on small fruit of introduced golden trees. They have short beaks. So notice right here, you have the average, right? Larger, longer beaks, smaller beaks. That is evolution. Because different genes are giving rise, gene changing, right? The genes are changing randomly to support different environments. That is evolution. Evolution is the change in allele or genetic frequencies. And so you're like, well, we're still talking about the same bug. Yes, but evolution is not defined by that. The evolution is defined by allele frequencies. So correlation between fruit size and beak size has been observed in other locations. This is evolution. Only happened in 35 years. A more sinister example is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. MRSA genetic varieties are dangerous pathogens, genesis of suffering pathos. So there's this one clone where it causes a flesh-eating disease and potentially fatal infections. But notice this. Methicillin resistance, ability to colonize hosts, increased disease severity, that would be virulence factor, increased gene exchange. All of these are adaptations that increase fitness, which leads to evolution. Okay? Antibiotics has saved millions and millions of lives, but there's an evolutionary arms race. There's always a race between a new antibiotic and when resistance comes out. Resistance to penicillin happened in 1945, documented. Just 2 years after it was introduced. Why? Because bacteria reproduce crazy fast and random mutations happen, and one of those mutations gave an advantage. It survived when the antibiotic was around. Also evolved resistance to methicillin. 2 years. It just took 2 years of its widespread use. Okay? Methicillin works by destroying the bacterium's ability to make cell walls. So they survive and reproduce at higher rates than others. MRSA strains are now resistant to many different antibiotics. And so here's a key thought here. Natural selection does not create new traits, but selects for traits already present. So how do new traits come to be? How do we get all these new traits if we came from one single cell? Well, evolution would teach there had to be a lot of positive information added. And that information added is found in mutations. But most mutations are neutral or negative. And so it takes faith to believe, anything. It really does. Evolution by natural selection can occur rapidly in species with short generations times. And that rapidly has been more defended lately. Okay, so let's look at evidences. First off, homology. Homology is similarity resulting from common ancestry. Again, common ancestry is we all share a common ancestor, and then we branch off with differences, and then keep branching off various differences, but that one common ancestor is right there. And then we can have recent common ancestors, which would be like right here, and right here, and right here, depending upon in the A, B, C, D, E, all these different species, okay? So, an example, forelimbs of all mammals show the same arrangement of bones. Anatomical, which is, of course, what something looks like, represent variations on a structural theme. So right here, you see how it has one bone, a couple bones, many? And that's the same in the cat, sorry for the words, whale, bat. That is homology. That's homologous structures. Comparative embryology reveals anatomical similarities that are developing when you're developing inside as in the womb. For example, a chicken and a human both have a postanal tail and both have pharyngeal pouches. Due to apoptosis, that tail shrinks back. Evolutionists actually used to call these gills, but that's completely wrong. That's been disproven. They're like, oh, humans have gills. We have our inner fish, because life came from the sea according to evolution. But that's been disproven. And why do these things exist? Well, you could dive into that and talk about it. We don't have time for the scope of this video. Again, there's you, cute little you, right? And then, but look, we look similar. Common designer or random chance. Vestigial structures are remnants, which means leftovers. For example, snakes arose from ancestors with legs. Skeletons of some snakes retain vestiges of the pelvis and leg bones. So why do snakes, why do whales still have a pelvis, pelvic bones and stuff? Well, there could be similarities, or, the earth could be old as well. Some Christians believe that the earth is really, really old and allows for all these changes within kinds. So molecular homologies are shared genes, again, inherited from a common ancestor. Homologous genes can be found in organisms as dissimilar as humans and bacteria. Yes, we share similarities between bacteria with certain genes. There's similar life processes that we all need to carry out. Many organisms have retained genes that have lost their functions. So this is just summarizing everything that we just talked about. Different cause of resemblance is something called convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is the evolution of similar or analogous features in distantly related groups. So for example, this is all about, how do you get similar traits when you're not even closely related? Remember, natural selection, it's all about similar environments. Sugar gliders and flying squirrels. Marsupials versus eutherians. They look similar, but they're not closely related based upon genetic analysis. Why do they look so similar? Because they come from similar environments. So this is convergent evolution. You need to know that definition, okay? Fossils, exhibit A for evolution usually, super important. Fossils are fascinating, and there's so many great discussions to be had as far as defending the faith goes with fossils. I would ask your teachers, but for our purposes, they're the remains and traces of past life. Darwin saw the glyptodon, and he realized it's related to the armadillo. And so fossils record the history of life from the past. Now, in order for you to get to A to C in a species, there had to have been some sort of transitional form. And so transitional fossils are a common ancestor for two different groups. When usually you talk about transitional form, the first name that comes up in circles is called Tiktaalik or Tiktaalik. I'm not sure, I forget how you say it. And so if life came from the oceans, so 380 million years ago, sorry, that's horrible. Well, you had to have like a walking fish eventually, right? Early amphibian. And so people look at this as a transitional fossil. And then here's like the whale evolution. The whale evolution is kind of crazy because and it's really interesting. I have an article, but whales basically started in the ocean and they went to land, Pakicetus, and then they went back to the ocean. It's pretty over millions and millions of years. So it's really kind of interesting to have some fun discussion about some of this. But the fossil record, for our purposes, it does document patterns of change, as far as, biological science goes. They've changed through time, and many species have gone extinct. Fossils shed light on the origins. For example, cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises evolved from a shared ancestor with like the hippopotamus and the pigs and deers and cows. So again, looking at anatomical, there's the ancient whale Pakicetus. Okay, fossils can also document the steps in important transitions. For example, the transition from land to sea and the ancestors of cetaceans. So where's Pakicetus? There's Pakicetus, a walking whale. And so, this is a phylogenetic tree. We'll talk about that down the road, but all of this points right here, common ancestors, okay? So the fossil record shows that living cetaceans, cetaceans, I think it's that, and their close relatives, the even-toed ungulates, are more different from each other today than they were earlier on. And then biogeographical evidence. Biogeography is the study of the range and distribution of plants and animals throughout the world. So where do things live? Biogeographical distributions are consistent with the hypothesis that related forms of life evolved in one locale and then spread to accessible regions. A different mix of plants and animals would be expected whenever geography separates continents. And so this is biogeography, and Darwin saw this on his voyage, right? HMS Beagle, 5 years. Why are there no kangaroos in Europe? Why are there no sugar gliders in Brazil? The Australian wombat, why is it just in Australia? And so Earth's continents, Pangea is a common thought, right? All the continents were together, and there is some strong evidence for that. And then continental movement, like the continents are moving now, and a modern distribution of species allows us to predict when and where a species evolve. Islands generally have many endemic, this is a term I would know, species found nowhere else in the world. And these species, Darwin suggested, arose as a result of colonists adapting to new environment. Also, evidence for evolution, biochemical evidence. We're talking like DNA here, and this is now the first stop on our evidence list. It uses the basic, utilize the same triplet code, utilize the same amino acids, same. Notice all those same words, right? And so DNA differences. So when we're very similar in genetics, recent common ancestor. When we're very different, it's just a more ancient common ancestor. And so here's an example of cytochrome C. That's a protein that plays a role in the electron transport chain in mitochondria. And you should be able to tell me all about that right now, right? And so this is the number of amino acid differences, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Well, between the monkey and the human, then there's like a couple, right? But between the human and the yeast, there's like 50 plus, right? And so this shows you that monkey and human are closely related according to evolution. Therefore, they share a more common cytochrome C coming from DNA. Remember, DNA, central dogma, RNA to protein. That leads that, okay? And so I gave you some questions to do and a scientific skills activity in class and handouts. I want you to do all of that. Here's a question I want you to work on. Pause and work on it. It's in your notes as well. We won't talk about that. And here's your final question. Okay, we'll talk about all this in class. Super proud of you. You're awesome. Much love in Christ. God bless.